Today, we are going to create a tier list for pets based on their active skills. This way, it will be easier for you to focus on a pet type that helps you the most. A pet's active skill is unique to the type of familiar and has a 20-second cooldown. By the way, my ranking will be based on the consistent usefulness and hit rate of active skills. I want to start with Brood Talon. And actually, we can talk about Brood Talon and Skitterwhite together since both of these pets work pretty similarly. Both create an area that continually deals damage, and each hit can trigger passive skills with an active skill trigger. Not all of them are consistent, but Steel Hide, Ignition, Ice Touch, Concuss, and others can be triggered. The damage of both pets is very good, and the area of effect is pretty large. Like I said, when this area is well positioned, it will trigger a lot of passive skills. That's why I think these two familiars belong in the S tier. By the way, your character's own critical hit chance applies to your familiars as well. So if you have a decent critical hit chance, passive skills like Concuss can become pretty strong. You can create a lot of good combinations with passive skills that benefit from continual damage. Now, let's talk about the most popular familiar, Dusk Prowler the cat. First of all, the skill effect described in the game is wrong. The shield does not burst when it disappears or when it gets destroyed. A big thanks to this Reddit user for bringing this up, and if I'm not mistaken, this Reddit post has already been shared with developers via the partner program. Anyway, the correct description should be something like this. After activation by the cat, the player receives a shield that, upon getting hit, causes a counterattack equal to 30% of the damage to nearby enemies, as long as the shield's amount is present and its duration is active. Each counterattack damage hit acts like the area of the dragon or the worm. Each damage hit triggers passive skills with the active skill trigger. So, this active skill is good for PvP, but quite useless for PvE. We always like having shields in PvP, but the way this shield works actually makes you benefit less from passive familiar skills. Most of the passive skills have a percentage chance to be triggered, and since the cat's shield only does damage when you get hit, and it only hits players close to you, you don't get much benefit from the passive skills. This makes it just good as a defensive shield and nothing more. That's why I'm putting the cat a little below. Next, we have Varro the goat. Varro's active skill hits consistently enough, so in group fights, it lands most of its damage, and in 1 versus 1 situations, it forces the enemy to move around. The damage itself is decent, and since it hits quite often, it is good for triggering passive skills. Even though using the goat is fun, I think it's a tier below Brood Talon and Skitterwhite. You can't really compete with their area of effect damage on the tight roads of battlegrounds. Now, let's talk about Stormlost. Stormlost falls off a bit due to its duration, and thus the limited options for passive skill triggers. However, its stun is very effective for interrupting opponents and also shines in group fights, especially for idols. So, I think we can place Stormlost in the A tier, alongside the GOAT. By the way, don't underestimate this familiar. It might be ranked higher after more testing. Next, we have Quake Strider. Quake Strider's ability, the Suction Vortex, is much weaker and shorter than the new 5-star gem, Maw of the Deeps effect. When used together, they don't reinforce each other, so it's not that effective. It is rarely really useful and is almost negligible as a control effect, although the damage is decent. So, this familiar belongs in the C tier. Now, let's talk about Mir Yen. This familiar's skill sounds really nice on paper, but it rarely works properly. It's sad that it doesn't work all the time. It's worth significantly more in PvE than in PvP, but there are still much better options. So, we can put this one in the D tier. And lastly, we have Ash Sweeper. This one's skill only does damage. And while the damage is nice, since it only deals damage once, the options for triggering passive skills are limited. Additionally, the skill's delay is sometimes too long, which means it often doesn't hit at all in PvP. I guess we can place this one in the C tier. So, in conclusion, our tier list looks like this. Another thing you need to understand from this video is the importance of passive skills and how well they work together with the active skill of the familiar. Depending on your own build, the passive skills of the pet, and the active skill trigger options, there are interesting combinations that are pretty effective. And that's all for this video. I will leave the links to the Reddit posts that I used as sources for this video in the description. Thanks for listening and see you in the next one.